Welcome everyone to this webinar on harmful sexual behaviour affecting children and young people. It's hosted by Schools Week, the digital newspaper, and this webinar is especially for professionals working with children. We're expecting a lot of teachers to be tuning in, but also healthcare professionals, social workers, and so on as well. I'm going to let our two panellists today introduce themselves and just explain briefly their involvement in preventing harmful sexual behaviour. So shall we start off with you, Carmel?
Sure. Hi, thanks for having us. My name's Carmel. I run the service, which is the Harmful Sexual Behaviour Support Service, run by the Southwest Grid for Learning. Previous to that, I also operate the Professionals Online Safety Helpline, which you might have heard of as well. We support anyone working with children and young people dealing with any online safety issues. So the Harmful Sexual Behaviour Support Service is very similar in its remit, but does focus on harmful sexual behaviours instead.
We can come on to that. Thanks so much, Carmel. And just briefly you as well, Lawrence, explain who you are, what your role is, and just quickly what your involvement is.
Yes, Sonny, thank you. I'm Lawrence. I work with the Mary Collins Foundation, which is a charity that responds to technology-assisted child sexual abuse. We work in collaboration with Carmel over at the Southwest Grid, looking at providing some additional support in regards to more complex cases that they may be dealing with, or if there's any response that requires either a social worker or a police side of intervention and the perspective from that. So as I'm a qualified social worker, as is one of my colleagues and a recently retired police, they'll helpline practitioners just tend to give us a quick call and just run through anything that's a bit more complex.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to you two. And just to kind of give a bit of a move back into sort of the historical view on this and why we're talking about this today. Obviously, harmful sexual behaviour affecting children and young people is nothing new, very sadly, but it's certainly absolutely burst into the spotlight. I think there was a sort of series of things that were involved in that. We obviously had the Me Too movement around about 2017, although this has all kind of come later than that, but that really put, and I'm sure you'd agree, sexual harassment very much into the mainstream media, how we react to that as a society, how we support victims of that, the problem of the very low prosecution rate following allegations of sexual harassment. And then in around about 2020, a young person began sharing their experiences of being sexually harassed, which eventually led to the Everyone's Invited website. And that then really took off with a kind of viral numbers of people getting in touch to share their stories after the awful rape and murder of Sarah Everard in 2021. And that website, you know, ended up with, I actually had a quick check this morning, something like 50,000 submissions of incidences that have happened to young people. So as we know, that really kicked off a huge conversation about what was going on. And the thing that was extraordinary about Everyone's Invited was that it was about what was going on in schools. And a lot of schools were named. So I won't go on too much longer, but that's sort of where we were at around about 2021. And then Ofsted decided to, well, with the Department for Education, decided to take action. So Carmel, can we start with you and just sort of get a bit of an idea of why the Harmful Sexual Behaviour Support Service was set up, and talk to me a little bit about what happened after Everyone's Invited and Ofsted then starting to take action in that. Give us a idea of why we're here.
Sure. So as you've just quite nicely set the scene there was obviously a lot going on in 2020 and 2021 with subsequent lockdowns and teaching going on from home, which I think perhaps acted as a bit of a catalyst to some of this, and especially perhaps the Everyone's Invited website, everyone being at home and engaging more on social media. That then led to the Ofsted review, which we're all probably quite familiar with now. I think that's kind of been talked about quite a bit, and there was some kind of, headline stats and findings within that, quite alarming numbers, such as 90% of girls and nearly 50% of boys being sent explicit images or videos of things that they didn't want to see. About 92% of girls and 74% of boys said sexist name calling happens a lot, and that basically that the frequency of this sort of behaviour going on in school is quite normalised. So I think that the Ofsted review really kind of put on paper what a lot of people that have been working in education have been saying for quite a while. And I don't think for us, I remember when it came out, there was lots of headlines of shocking, and it wasn't particularly shocking or surprising for us, but I think some of the content within it was upsetting, and obviously it's quite sad to see the scale of that and the amount of schools that and young people that are affected by this.
Absolutely. And I mean, I was taking a read back through the review, and it did say, you know, you mentioned that it was something a lot of education leaders knew about, but Ofsted are also very clear that teachers in some cases were totally unaware of the scale of what young people and particularly girls were dealing with. Was that something that you kind of expected to come out of the review, that actually schools in many cases were not aware of how big the problem was?
I think that there's perhaps sometimes a reluctance to acknowledge that sort of stuff, or to believe that your school, that our children aren't like that. But I think even if you look in our wider society, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because we see this like behaviour all the time, and certainly in terms of misogyny and the objectification of women that happens with adults in our media, on our televisions. Yeah, I think that sometimes perhaps schools don't want to acknowledge that this is happening in their school, or they feel that, you know, that they would know about it. But also we do know from that report and from other research that's happened that children are really unlikely to come and report these issues to schools, because they don't feel they're going to get the help that they need, or that the help that they're going to get is way over the top, and that there's going to be lots of consequent actions that happens from them making disclosures. So yeah, perhaps some schools weren't aware of what was going on when they're in student body, because their students aren't coming and telling them, which I think is an issue within itself.
Absolutely. And one of the things I also found really interesting in the report was it said, you know, what leaders were unsure about was sometimes how to proceed. So one of the quotes from Ofsted was, some school and college leaders told us they are unsure how to proceed when a criminal investigation had not led to a prosecution or a conviction. And I can see how that would be so difficult to know what to do after that. I mean, it's been proven not guilty, so therefore you think, well, quite clearly, not guilty, so innocent, just got to continue as though everything's normal. But if other pupils in the schools still don't feel like that, I can imagine that puts school leaders in a very tricky position. If the police have decided one thing, but you're still getting feedback from your pupils that's quite different. I don't know if that was something that you clocked in the report as well, and just that's the sympathy, I guess, for leaders in very tricky positions on this.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't want to be a teacher right now with some of the stuff that we've been hearing over the last year, and it is a really difficult position to be in. And I think that there's that conflict, because we need to support victims and we need to keep victims in our focus, and be very trauma informed and led with that. But then we also need to still educate those who perhaps are being accused or are perpetrators of harmful sexual behaviour, for want of a better word, and to ensure that actually, you know, just because someone's done something wrong once doesn't mark them for life, and actually they have a chance to recover from that and maybe learn from that. I went to a conference yesterday, and they had a really interesting one of the researchers had a really interesting idea of calling people in. So rather than calling out behaviour all the time and singing them out and putting them out of the room, what does that do? That kind of only maybe perhaps encourages feelings of negativity and alienation. What we need to be doing is including people, calling them in to help create better solutions and understanding those behaviours in a bit of a deeper way. I've done that, I've explained that in a really
no, I really like that, calling in rather than calling out. And
yeah.
I think actually the founder of the Everyone's Invited page has said herself she doesn't believe in cancel culture. And I know that's not exactly what you mean, but that idea that it will only work if everybody becomes educated and feels like they can, if they've made a very serious mistake. I'm not calling all of them a mistake, but if you need to really learn much better behaviour, that there will also be a space in which you can learn that. But it must be such a tricky line for schools at times, in terms of what to do. I mean, I actually ran an opinion piece I found really interesting not so long ago from a member of staff who was very upset that an autistic young man I think he had touched the sparkly tights of a teacher when they were both sort of in a one-on-one, and had ended up being accused of sexual harassment, and that this very autistic young man felt that he had just literally been wanting to see what the sparkly tights felt like. So my goodness, so difficult in some of those situations to decide, because it might not just be between young people, it might be a younger member of staff who also feels uncomfortable. Although that's not touched on in Ofsted's review, is it? But again, just a really difficult situation, perhaps especially where they're not obviously necessarily, but perhaps where there's neurodiversity as well, and other considerations.
Yeah, and I think that I think you're right. There's so much pressure and difficult decisions that schools and teachers are having to make at the moment. And I feel like in my other role as the lead of the Professionals Online Safety Helpline, that has been evident for years as well. And then we just seem to be adding more and more roles into schools and on teachers. We're asking them to teach, we're asking them to do pastoral work, we're asking them to be social workers, police officers. There's only so much schools and teachers can do, and I think that does show, and in terms of neurodiversity and special educational needs, that has always come out in reports and things that we've looked at before with online safety as well, because if you think it's difficult to try and teach some of these lessons to children that aren't that don't have those issues, try adding something else into the mix. It adds sometimes a different frame to things.
Of course, and they can be particularly vulnerable as well to harmful sexual behaviour. Yeah,
we see that a lot again across both helplines, where perhaps especially online, you want to make friends, and they perhaps don't understand or pick up on the social cues where people aren't necessarily being friendly and actually they're trying to exploit them. So there's a lot going on there. I won't go fully into special educational needs because we could talk about that for hours, and we don't have time for that today.
It's an important thing to remember. As you say, the thing for schools is that they have all of these responsibilities on them, and safeguarding is such a massive one. You fall down in your safeguarding category in an Ofsted inspection, and it will be the one thing that takes you from an outstanding down to a inadequate rate. Not that that's the most important thing here, but it's such a big important part of their role, and of course this is partly what the Harmful Sexual Behaviour Support Service is about. So talk to me a little bit about exactly who Southwest Grid for Learning are, and how it was you came to be running that, and then we can talk about what exactly it is. So who is your organisation, Carmel, and how did you get involved in helping to run this?
So the Southwest Grid for Learning has been around for a very long time. Initially we acted as an internet consortium when we sold internet to schools. That whole system changed, but we really focused on online safety and always have been as an organisation. That led us to become 1/3 of the UK Safer Internet Centre. Actually, we're the lead partner in that organisation, which is one of 30 odd centres across the whole of Europe. So we come together with the UK Safer Internet Centre comes together with Childnet International and the Internet Watch Foundation, who you're probably aware of, and we create this powerhouse of online safety and information resources for young people, professionals and parents. So at the Southwest Grid for Learning, our kind of role within the UK Safer Internet Centre primarily, we do a lot of things, but the one I'm going to talk about is the one that I do, which is the helplines. So we run the Professionals Online Safety Helpline, which has been in operation for over 10 years now. As I said at the beginning, that's open to anyone that's working with children and young people dealing with any online safety issues. As you can imagine, it's a very broad church of things that we deal with on that helpline. In 2017, also we launched 2018, sorry, we launched the Report Harmful Content platform, which is available for anyone over the age of 13 that's online using the internet and wants to report harmful content online. So one of our key strengths across both of those helplines is that we have really strong relationships with industry and a strong understanding of safeguarding, both in education and just online more generally.
Brilliant. And what was it, a contract you won with the department, or how does that work exactly with the harmful sexual behaviour support service?
Yeah, so obviously running helplines is our thing. We're really good at it. So we there was a bid that came up, I think around November last year, to launch a support service that had pretty much the same remit as the Professionals Online Safety Helplines, so supporting anyone with working with children and young people, but dealing with specifically harmful sexual behaviour. And I think that funding was there in response to what we'd seen earlier in the year with the Ofsted report. So we put in a bid with that along with the Marie Collins Foundation, because while we're really good at running helplines, we don't necessarily have the expertise in harmful sexual behaviour. We know lots about safeguarding generally, but we really needed their support and understanding around harmful sexual behaviour specifically. So we put that bid in, and I think within a couple of weeks we knew it was a very quick turnaround, so I think we knew we were successful at the start of December, and then we launched the helpline on the 10th of January. So it was
brilliant.
Really,
so it's a helpline and resources, and because I saw an email address as well that teach. So
yeah.
So just talking through the range of offers, and then we'll bring in Lawrence in as well.
It's a helpline primarily, so you can it runs through telephone or email, and it's open from 8 AM till 8 PM. So the guys that sat on the phones and on the emails are safeguarding professionals that we've worked with for years, and they're very well trained in this field. They're there to talk you through any issues that you're having. And then we can signpost onto relevant resources or information that would help you.
Got it. So all those confusing situations we were talking about earlier, theoretically a teacher can ring that line and say, look, got this going on, and are you actually going to get the answer to your problem, or are you going to more likely get signposted to a resource, or can they actually directly advise them this is what you should be doing according to the guidance, according to the law?
Yeah, so a bit of both. And I think what's come out of it is that teachers and schools, they do know what they're doing, but it's really good to have someone to talk that through with, and just to get a second opinion. And a lot of the time what we're saying is, yep, you're doing everything right, and actually maybe we could just be doing this and that as well. So yeah, it's a really reassuring, I think, for the people calling to have that conversation.
Brilliant. Okay, let's bring you in, Lawrence, and thank you so much for waiting. So just remind us again of your role at the Marie Collins Foundation, and then, since I was just asking Carmel, do explain your guys' involvement in helping to run the harmful sexual behaviour support service, and then we can go on to some other topics.
Yeah, so I'm Lawrence Jordan. I'm the professional lead for Marie Collins Foundation. My role in regards to the harmful sexual behaviour support service is to provide some additional knowledge and information around sexual abuse, harmful sexual behaviour, and areas that may already be open to social services or other statutory agencies. Provide some greater insight in regards to that.
Got it. So you're an advisor to the Southwest Grid for Learning.
Yeah, no, if there's complex cases come through, so if there's some information comes through, we'll upload and upskill the helpline practitioners as and when they need it. And then if there's a call that comes through, as Carmel says, we're quite often responsive to any questions there may be. And it may be sometimes that there's some additional aspects to the inquiry that the helpline practitioners may just think, do you know, I just want to run this past someone, just pick someone else's brains on this. So there's myself, the CEO, who's also a social worker, and we've got Phil, who's 18 years, child abuse investigation unit, police officer. And between the three of us and the helpline practitioners, we more or less can give an answer. If we don't, we have to put that back to them.
That's absolutely fantastic, isn't it? Like the sort of, I don't want to, overhype it, super experts that can be linked through on the phone line. Are you able to share a little bit, like any details, but what are some of those more complex cases that teachers are ringing up at? What might be a typical inquiry that you three put your heads together on to try to help them?
So in some cases, I'd say give you an example about a call we had in regards to where there was some more complexities, was the child was in the care system, and there was some questions. I think the teacher that rang up was unaware of some of the elements of the care system, and that the child was being moved around, and some of the behaviour in their care settings was causing additional concern. So the school was bringing up to say that they wanted to escalate and challenge children's social care on what they thought they were doing. They didn't know really quite some of the reasons why children's social care were doing what they were doing.
Right.
And we were able to, and the helpline practitioner was able to certainly go through some of the concerns within the setting, and really clarify with the teacher that called in actually what their concerns were and why they thought that. So it really helped that teacher to really crystallise, actually, there is a concern here, and how am I going to explain that concern without just standing going, I'm worried and I don't think you're doing enough. So it's able to really quantify what that concern was. And then obviously the helpline practitioner then spoke to us and said, well, with the child in care, we've got this. And we were then able to suggest things which would be more specific. So looking at the independent reviewing officer, bringing them into place, actually in regards to the care setting, what some of the terminology was being used. The teacher wasn't too gone on, so we were able to clarify that. And then we were just able to say, well, actually, these are some of the additional options. So the looked after child nurse, they could come in and they could perhaps do a bit of work there. So we were able to provide that side of stuff. Sometimes it's more the legal side, where either an investigation is ongoing or there's some confusion about what officers are saying or what the interaction with them. So we're able to go to our officer or recently retired officer and say, does that fit right for you in regards to that? And I think more often, as Carmel's alluded to, the helpline practitioners are really good at having that. It's almost like a reflective supervision for the person calling in to help them identify their concerns, and to be able to say to them on a number of cases, okay, have you considered this? Okay, so you've done X, Y, and Z. That's not working, or you're still not sure that's enough. Have you dealt with this? And if there's challenges with thresholds not being met, we can then say, but you need to quantify this. You need to evidence that you've done that, or that's past that stage. Right. And I would do those. So those are when we're there, and we're on call. So whenever the helpline's open, there'll be one of us on call for that.
That's brilliant. Like what a resource. I wish actually there was not that we need it that often, but it would be great to have a similar hotline for some sticky media law things that we sometimes come across, and it's really good that schools can access that. I wonder whether one of the things that actually can be quite confusing for members of staff is actually identifying what is harmful sexual behavior, because obviously sexual behavior is something, particularly in sixth form, that young people are often engaging with. What is the definition of harmful sexual behavior, Lawrence?
Yeah, and Jess, you're so right. It's incredibly challenging for professionals, particularly in the educational setting, to identify and respond. The most common definition we have, and bear with me as I read it to you, is sexual behaviour expressed by children and young people aged under the age of 18 that are developmentally inappropriate, may be harmful towards their self or to others, or abusive towards another child, young person or adult. So what I basically mean by that really is behaviour that we would look at. It's sexual. There's a sexual element in nature, but actually it's either inappropriate to the child, so it may be at that stage touching themselves in an appropriate location, or it may be that it starts to become problematic. So we may start seeing that someone is starting to have a compulsion to view pornography, and actually that's very much shaping their responses to things, to moving into more harmful forms, which would be abusive and violent. So there we're starting to see a very much a power imbalance, a lot of coercion. We're starting to move now more into sexual assaults, rapes, and those sort of things, or violent or psychological elements of control. So I think the challenge for education staff, as you've said, is actually they've got to respond to behaviour, but also to know actually what that child's developmental age, their cognitive understanding is, and then to apply that with what would I expect a 3-year-old if it's in an early years setting, or what would I expect a 14, 15-year-old's behaviour to be broadly appropriate. You know, these are still children learning and developing, but broadly appropriate in regards to this. And then what would I start saying, actually, this is a concern I now need to interact in regards to that.
Yeah. Are you able to provide resources, or even a kind of, I don't want to be too sort of blunt about it, but a chart or something to educators so that they can see what age and age appropriate and inappropriate behavior might be. And if I was going to go into teacher training tomorrow, I would honestly have no clue really, because I can't go against my own experience at school of my peers. I'm pretty sure a lot of people were starting stuff too early. So I wouldn't really. Is there a kind of package or training that teachers can get so they get a better idea developmentally, neurologically, what age appropriate and inappropriate means?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is training out there. I always tend to defer people to Simon Hackett's continuum of harmful sexual behaviour, and I know the NSPCC have developed it slightly, and it's basically it's a good way of rag rating to be able to see actually, you know, if a child was being a bit inappropriate, actually a little bit what that looks like. For me, quite often I think what really reinforces that is if you know actually what that developmental age, that behaviour actually looks like, and what would be okay at that specific age, and what would be okay, we need to do perhaps a little bit of work with this child here, or with their parents, or actually this requires specialist intervention. And I know Brooke brought out the traffic light tool. And so if you really are struggling, I mean, the difficulty is children haven't read our manuals, and that's part of the problem. So their behaviour doesn't always nicely fit into what we produce. So in some cases, you're going to have to apply a little bit of professional understanding to say, okay, this is, say, a very young behaving 5-year-old. So I'm going to be seeing their behaviour slightly in a couple of years younger, maybe.
Right.
That's a very mature 5-year-old who I'd be expecting behaviour of those. And that's without trying to minimise the behaviour, but it's about you being person-centred, about knowing the children in your classroom, sort of thing. In regards to, and that's a lot clearer. So that will say very, very much what expected behaviour would be. So if a child was, say, looking and touching their genitalia, and it was for the under 5s, you think, okay, that's pretty much okay if that's in private. But if it's done in the classroom, then no, we just need to remind the child that there's more appropriate places for that, and you can intervene there. Obviously, if that was a 15, 16-year-old doing that in the classroom, that's a very different response, and the concerns for that. So we always suggest that there are others out there. And Jess, you said a really good point, you know, when there is the inset days and when there is the teacher training days, actually, is anybody pulling these charts out? You know, they know their schools, they know the age of the pupils within the schools or within their classrooms, and say, so really, you know, I know their learning age is around here. We've got the modules that we can do this. I know their developmental stages are here, emotionally they're here. Where is there in their sexual development? And often that's the bits are missing. So always take that opportunity to say, well, actually, we deal with 7 to 8 year olds in our class. We'd expect to see this, and if we didn't, okay, this is what we need to do to respond.
Got it. I'm just listening to you there because there's that distinction, isn't there, between harmful sexual behaviour, perhaps that, you know, being a 16-year-old touching yourself inappropriately in a classroom, but then sexual abuse, which I imagine we wouldn't think that was. So what is the line, and what are the indicators of harmful sexual behaviour versus sexual abuse? And at what point does doing a lot of harmful sexual behaviour, is there a strong indicator that you're likely to go on to be sexually abusive, or what's the evidence on that? But first of all, what's the line between those two?
Yeah, no, great question. There's a lot of myths about that side of things. I mean, the definition for sexual abuse is in the Working Together to Safeguard Children, which I'm sure we all regularly read. I know I certainly do every evening. But so the clear definition is in regards there. What we're looking at here is there will be harmful sexual behaviour that is abusive in nature, and actually may tip into that, particularly if there's a serious age imbalance or power imbalance, and we're starting to see that comes over that. And the same with the criminal side of things, it moves into that.
So perhaps if we took an example such that, I mean, sending a unwanted nude to somebody, to a minor, you know, is that harmful sexual behaviour, that sexual abuse, or again, is it just not that clear cut?
Yeah, I mean, officially, you know, it's an offence under legislation. It would be showing indecent image to a child, which then meets the definition of sexual abuse, and then actually it's harmful. So it fits all three. The reality is I think context and proportion are the key words whenever you're dealing with harmful sexual behaviour. Right. And in this case, the sending of that unwanted image, although is often more distressing to the person who receives it than we give credit to. Actually, the conversation there is with the child, the inappropriate element of that, the context of why did they send that image. Research tells us that most children and most adults that send indecent images of themselves is really trying to get an image back. That's usually the motivation behind that behaviour. So actually, it's worth to say that actually that is an offence under that, and then obviously the police have their outcomes that they can be done. The child has a right, if they feel that offence has been committed against them, they may want to report that to the police. And then the schools often find themselves really in the middle of all of this stuff going on around them. And quite often, as you alluded to earlier, it may not progress to a full investigation or any criminal charges. So then it falls back to the school again to pick out the pieces for. So although sending an image would meet all that criteria, depending on the image they sent, whether this was a common issue, if this is done time after time and you've spoken to this child about this, then that would be a concern. And then obviously I'll be looking at that. There's more to this behaviour that may meet the eye. The victim's perspective as well, where they want to do with this. And sometimes, you know, bringing the parents in with the means instead of saying, well, you know, these are some of the options we have here in regards to this. But usually it will be down to the schools to say, actually, we'll have a word, check with the person who received the image. Are you happy if we speak to this? If they're happy and that sort of thing, you're going to speak to the child and usually their parents in respect to that. But if it's a sadistic image or there's an element to it that brings you concern or it's a regular thing, then obviously you may be a wider conversation, say, what is going on here? Do we need to now speak to our colleagues in Children's Social Care, MASH and the police, just to say this is an ongoing problem, and actually the chances are this child's going to get into a lot more problems when they're older if they continue this behaviour.
Got it. No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Lawrence. And that brings us nicely on to my next question for you, Carmel, which is I was just going to ask you what your advice would be to other professionals working with children and young people about making a referral, such as into social care. What are the situations where a referral might be needed, and what's your advice around making that kind of referral?
So every area is slightly different in terms of what their thresholds are for accepting referrals, but I would say generally if you feel like it's beyond the school's capability to deal with, right, there might be issues going on outside of school that you can't affect or change, such as if you suspect that there's abuse going on at the home, then a referral to social services, to social care, or to your local safeguarding board would be the best next step to make. If the school can't deal with it, you need to get external help. Making referrals can be time consuming and a little bit tricky sometimes, and I think you know, the best bits of advice I could give would be to include everything you know about that child. So if there are any kind of historical events or issues that have happened previously, include that. It might be something quite insignificant or something that you feel is small, but it could help paint the picture. and also to use the language that will use the correct language when describing what their behaviours are. For example, if they've been touching people repeatedly, or and being told no and continuing, and touching them in places where they don't want to be touched, call that it's assault. Use the correct language that's going to actually ring those bells, so that when you're making the referral, people understand what it is that you're trying to put forward.
Got it. No, that's really, really useful. Do we know what the waiting times are like? I've no idea about this area. If a teacher calls today, Thursday, to social services, what's the sort of, what do you know what they're sort of seeing in terms of?
Be completely different in every area. I wouldn't be able to tell you that at all.
No, don't worry.
And some areas, so unfortunately it's a bit of a postcode lottery. Some areas have dedicated harmful sexual behaviour groups and support services directly. Some people you just have to go through to your MASH team, or whatever it looks like in your area. But yeah, no, the waiting time should be very different, I imagine.
Got it. And do we know, and I don't know whether we share with teachers and professionals, what the contributing factors are towards harmful sexual behaviour? So I wonder if we know certain things can make a young person more likely to display those, whether there's then a safeguarding flag in terms of what might be happening in their own home. But what are some of the contributing factors, and what does that tell us about how we should or shouldn't then proceed in responding to that child who's displaying that behaviour?
I think that there aren't many things that would you could say, right, yeah, that child's definitely going to go on to do something harmful. And I think that we need to always be aware, especially with our safeguarding hats on, that every child could be either lead to exhibiting harmful sexual behaviour, or be a victim or part of it unwillingly. So we need to not kind of look out for too many specifics, I would always say. But I think that there obviously are some children that are a bit more vulnerable than others. But I think more broadly, generally, looking at the culture within your school is really important. So is there like a boys will be boys attitude? Is there perhaps a culture of misogyny, catcalling, that sort of thing? Obviously, if the culture in the school is breeding this sort of toxic masculinity and those behaviours, then of course boys that perhaps you wouldn't even suspect would be going to do that might do that because of the kind of almost pact mentality that can occur in those spheres.
And that's a really good point, isn't it, about culture? And I think when there was that naming of schools and everyone's invited, and then the quite sort of interesting parallel example of the huge explosions in accusations of racism, which was a similar sort of, well, it was just banter or just jokes and so on. And actually, and this rings true from my time at school as well, some really hurtful and awful things being done and said. But again, staff in numerous cases saying it's something they were unaware of. It sounds like quite a silly question, but how can staff get involved in jokes between kids if they're not absolutely sure that they're harmless? Just give us an idea of how you'd advise teachers on that sort of question of banter and jokes. That's certainly where I saw misogyny at school. But
I think perhaps a good starting point in all of this is to actually review what you do as a standard anyway, whether that's in your RSE, have a look at how that's actually working, are children engaged, and then involve them. I think always having children involved in these conversations about where do you feel that the line is drawn, doing workshops with them around what jokes are and where the line is, how you feel, talking about empathy, and trying to get them on board as soon as possible. I think again, this is a much broader kind of suggestion, but I think a lot of people will be aware that relationships and sex education in England is it's there, but it's not always used. And I think especially over the last 3 years when we've been in and out of lockdowns. Some children won't have had any at all because they might have missed the week when it was being taught because they were off with COVID. And that I know anecdotally someone that I work with, her son's missed it for the last 2 years because one week he was off with the COVID and the next week he was in lockdown because his school only does 1 week a year. And so I think that we need to be thinking about how we can actually better use the curriculum that we have. Maybe
just quickly, in that instance, sorry, the sex education was only happening for 1 week a year in the school,
and that's quite common. We don't
really,
especially in primary.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think exactly, doesn't that just seem mad? That
it does a bit, really. And again, I think unless possibly something is done repeatedly over time, as a child, I feel like a week's chat doesn't really stick, or
exactly. So I think there's a big broader conversation that needs to be had about what our curriculum looks like in England. I know that actually in Wales they're doing some really progressive work where they've actually decided to intertwine RSE into the whole curriculum, so it's not just taught in blocks, it's not just taught singularly, it's taught throughout the whole of the curriculum, whether that's humanities, maths, English. And again, they're doing really big reviews as schools to understand what children want to talk about, what they want to learn about, and where their boundaries are and what they would feel actually uncomfortable talking about, and really involving them from the get-go. And I think that's a big ask, it's a big cultural shift, but I think it's something that we do need to see that would actually affect some real change in this space.
That sounds brilliant. I did read in the Ofsted report when I was doing my research last night that in their review published in June 2021, children and young people were rarely positive about the RSHE they had received. They felt it was too little, too late. The curriculum was not equipping them with the information advice they needed to navigate the reality of their lives. And then they were obviously going to talk to peers and looking on online and social media. So that's quite damning, rarely positive. And we know that the government have tried to do quite a lot of work around the RSHE curriculum and making it more compulsory. I know that you deliver this brilliant hotline, Carmel, but I was just wondering if a school listening to this thought, God, actually, we really do need to overhaul our RSHE, or could do with a bit more on the kind of sex education, harmful sexual behaviour side. Is there a website, or is there a case study? Is there a sort of ready to go curriculum they could look at, they could access to really start to think about changing that, or is that something they need to go and work out themselves? And
there's so much out there. I think that like I said, in Wales they're doing some really interesting work. I would really encourage anyone to go and have a look at what they're doing.
Okay.
I can't remember the name of it right off the top. I literally only learned about it yesterday, but I can share it post this talk. And then looking at kind of other organisations that you might want to, because I think one thing that's always drawn out from those bits of research is that children actually often feel quite uncomfortable having these conversations with their teachers. And sometimes their teachers might feel uncomfortable too. And that isn't really a good starting point. So maybe if you can draft in external help, there's some really amazing organisations in this country that will come in and help you. There's the Sex Explain, used to be called Sex Explain, Sex Education organisation. I'll remember that. There's Beyond Equality as well, that would do really amazing work with boys, kind of tackling toxic masculinity at a cultural level. There's loads. I will share them afterwards, but I think if you really are thinking about that, have a look at some of these other organisations and places that can help.
Got it. And just to sort of bring it into what's going on in the news at the moment, there's a sort of rather inappropriately named Pestminster scandal engulfing Westminster at the moment, with lots of allegations against MPs. And so it will be something as well that students, not only might they be seeing upsetting things online, or they've experienced something in their peer group, but if they see the news or catch the headlines, they'll be seeing that this is going on to some degree, or it appears to be, in terms of the allegations, at the very top level of government. So I imagine teachers will be being asked questions, and they really need to feel like they have the resources and the tools to answer them, don't they? When it's kind of at various levels of society, what young people are seeing is going on. I was just going to come back to you, Lawrence, and just ask whether you could actually clarify sexual consent for us.
I can, yes, and in fact, just picking up on what you were saying, often the children are really not educated around sexual consent at all. And in fact, when I was a statutory social worker, I went into a school and was doing some work with that school. And these were children that were just about to move into further education. So as I had no one, over the course of a week, I spoke to about 300 children. Not one could tell me the definition of rape. And you just think, wow, you know,
Right.
how are they going to know? And obviously once we started exploring that side of things, and we're looking at what constitutes consent and all of those areas, and they were horrified that they hadn't been taught. And actually they were quite angry that they've gone through a system that they didn't know this. So the definition of consent is in section 74 of the Sex Offence Act 2003. And it requires three things. It requires choice, freedom and capacity. If you don't have any of those,
choice, freedom and capacity.
Yep. So yes, please is usually a good choice. I would like to have some form of sexual interaction with you would be a choice. The freedom to do that rather than being forced to do that, or coerced or threatened in any way by violence or blackmail to engage in that, wouldn't meet that. And then the capacity, so that you're not under the influence of drugs, alcohol, you're awake, you're not having an epileptic seizure, those sort of things. So all of those need to happen. Now, the age of sexual consent is 16. I'm not sure if you're aware, that came from a journalist in 1885 that gave us that side of things. And what the difficulty is as well is to say 15-year-old children deeply in love that week are really not going to worry too much about legislation. And we have to be, again, proportionate in actually how we're going to respond to these side of things. So although the age of sexual consent is 16, Gillick competence and Fraser guidelines, which allows, and we're findings in court that allow certain professionals to be able to give condoms, that side of things, sexual health advice to people under the age of 16 without notifying their parents, are around.
Carmel, just to talk sort of finally back again onto the support service. You're 6 months in. What are your reflections at this point about either how the service is working, where or what you'd like to see it do next, or how it could be tweaked perhaps? And then, I don't know, any reflections on how staff have been using it the most. But yeah, where is it after 6 months in your view at the moment?
We've had some amazing learning that's happened from this helpline, and we've supported so many people. And I think that what we can do with that information and with the data that we've gathered is create some really good legacy resources, and hopefully some things that people can use moving forward to really help understand harmful sexual behaviour and challenge it and address those particular issues. What we've heard from staff is that they're really, as we've touched upon before, just really grateful to have someone to talk through these issues with, and to have that kind of added support and recognition that yes, what you're doing is fine and you are doing a good job. And I think that that's really always a lovely thing for teaching staff to hear, because they don't often maybe hear that enough. And I think you know, when we started off the helpline, we were kind of trying to imagine the sorts of things we would be hearing about, and we imagined it would be lower level kind of issues, and we do hear, you know, a lion's share of lower level kind of concerns, as we've touched on previously, around culture and general misogyny, catcalling, that sort of thing. But what we didn't perhaps expect was the amount of higher level concerns and issues reported to us, which I think is concerning and yeah, really worrying for those schools, and for us to hear actually there are some really serious instances of harmful sexual behaviour and actual sexual abuse and assault going on in schools, and they're not really knowing how to handle it or getting the support that they need. But as we've touched upon, I think one of the things that we've learned and understood from this project is those escalation routes, what they look like, and how best schools can use them to get support from local safeguarding services. And hopefully that's something that we'll be able to share post the project as well, to really encourage and help schools to make those correct referrals.
If they're still dealing with tricky issues, to get a call in soon, but also just for that kind of bringing together of all your knowledge and expertise into something that staff can go to if they don't have that hotline, but something they can at least read through in kind of a decision tree or whatever. That sounds like it'd be really, really worthwhile. So thank you so much to Lawrence Jordan at the Mary Collins Foundation and Carmel Glassbrook at the Southwest Grid for Learning, and all your great work that you're doing. And this is a webinar hosted by Schools Week on this issue. So thank you very much, both of you, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.